Hi, my name is Nicole Faye Golden, and I'm the host of Scar Stories podcast. We all walk through seasons of brokenness, and it's so easy to buy into the lies that we're alone, forgotten, weak, and too far gone. But here's what I want you to know. We all have scars, and so we all have stories. I'm really hoping these interviews resonate with you and that you walk away knowing that you aren't alone, you're never forgotten, you are strong enough, and there are always second chances. Thanks so much for tuning in, and welcome to Scar Stories. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to Scar Stories. My name is Nicole Golden. I am your host, and we have a very special guest with us. I want to introduce you to Toni Nieuwhof. And if we've got some dudes on here who are leadership podcast nerds, you may be recognizing that last name. Her husband is Carey Nieuwhof. And I am just so excited. I'm going to introduce this book beforehand because I'm going to be referring to it a lot throughout the interview, and it's going to be backwards on the screen. So if some of you, are dyslexic, this is your dream come true, but it's Before You Split by Toni Nieuwhof. I read this book in 24 hours, Toni. It was that good. I have to say, I have read so many marriage books, and I think my problem with marriage books, we're just going to jump right in. My problem with marriage books is always that they're so lofty. And it's always like, it tends to be like, this is a picture of what your marriage should look like. So here's everything that it should look like. Good luck in trying to do it. And I sometimes get so bogged down with those. And I feel like your book was so realistic. Like, yes, there is a bigger picture for what marriage should look like and should be. But the reality is, it sucks sometimes and it is hard. And we're all going to come to a point, more than likely, in our marriage, if we're real and if we're honest, that we're going to be like, man, there is a point where I really thought about running for the hills. And Toni just addresses really, okay, what do you do when you're at that crossroads of, do I stay or do I go? And she's so honest and so real. It's not guilt inducing at all. And you speak to such a wide audience. So Toni, thank you so much for writing this book. Like, we need it. It is so good.
Well, thank you. Thanks for saying that, Nicole. Hats off to you for reading it in 24 hours. I think you're the winner so far as what I've heard.
Yes, perfect. And I want to add with 4 kids in tow too. So I feel like I should be able to hold that title for a while. So Toni, you were a divorce attorney. Am I correct? I feel like it's like the different, like, are you a counselor? Are you a therapist? Are you a divorce attorney, a divorce lawyer? You were in that field. Can you tell us a little bit about what your actual title was, how long you were in it, and what that must have been like for you?
Yes. Well, a divorce attorney is what you call it in the US. In Canada, we call it a family lawyer.
Okay.
Whatever you call it, I was helping people make those legal arrangements after separating.
Okay.
So negotiating the separation agreement, following through with the divorce, that was my role.
Okay.
And as far as how that was for me, I went into family law as a transition from health law. So in my background, I'm also a pharmacist. I worked as a pharmacist while I went through law school. And so I practiced both for years. And then at a certain point, I decided I want to help people solve their problems. And so being a pastor's wife, I have heard the question over the years, how did you reconcile like being a Christian, but also being a divorce lawyer?
Isn't that funny? Because there's no way you can be divorced and saved or divorced and strong. It's so things we've got flying around. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and people who are going through divorce, they need help, and personally, I believe that, we need the light of Christ everywhere in our lives. And so for me, I didn't have that conflict. I didn't see it as a moral conflict. I mean, people who are going through divorce need help to understand what their legal options are, how they can make those decisions and keep the best interests of the whole family in mind. In particular, the emotions of divorce are so confusing and intense that I would say everyone who's making those decisions, especially if they have a family, they need an advocate for their family. They need advice that is specific and unique, but they also need somebody who can even be that voice of reason in those grieving moments,
Yeah.
when the threat may be that anger would take over, or fear would take over, and spite may take over, and push someone to want to make a decision that
Yeah.
they're actually going to regret in a year, 2 years, 5 years. And so part of my role as an advocate was to do my best to really help steer people through and say, hey, I can see this, you can't make this decision right now, it's not in your best interests, and try to get people to go to a counselor if they were really stuck in grief. So I didn't have any second thoughts about the role I was playing as a divorce attorney.
And I love that, because we need more, first of all, just Jesus followers that are willing to penetrate the darkness and be there for people. I think, when you
Mm.
look at the scriptures, like Jesus never worried about how something was going to look. He just found broken,
Mm.
hurting people and went after them. And I think too
Yes.
often, in the cancel culture, whatever we're living in now, we're so concerned about the optics of things. We're forgetting about where are the hurting people, and you're not going to
Mhm.
find any more hurting people than in a place where they're just at a dead end in their marriage and they don't know what to do. And to so have someone like you in their corner is incredible. I love that.
Mhm.
Was it difficult for you to not enter into the situation emotionally? I think that would have been so hard for me.
Yes, I don't think I was ever in a place where I turned my emotions off.
Yeah.
But I did need the skill of being able to be present with people in the moment, not have my emotions overtake me.
Mm.
Not that I never did like tear up, because as a divorce attorney, if there's anyone out there listening who practices in that area, you hear some absolutely heart-wrenching
I can imagine.
stories.
Yeah.
And it was normal to have people who were crying in my office every day.
Mm.
So the challenge for me was being able to shift out of my practice and into my home life and family life and
Mm.
everything else. And I would say it took me about a year of practice to make that transition, so that I didn't have, the emotional impact and the processing of my professional role going on in my mind and in our family space.
Yeah, yeah. And you have two boys, correct?
Yes.
And how old
Mhm.
were they at the time when you were practicing this?
I was, almost finished with the intense role of parenting when I made the transition into
Okay.
family law. So
Okay.
my older son was nearing the end of high school,
Okay.
and I
Okay.
stepped into that practice full time. And before
Okay.
that, I had been working professionally in hospitals, but part-time hours.
Okay.
So it had a fluidity to it,
Yes.
with our home life that made life a little more sane.
Yes, yes. That makes me feel a little bit better, because I'm like trying to imagine being in such an intense job and then coming home to, like, we have four,
Yes.
under, and I'm like, holy Moses, my brain exploded. Um,
Mm.
did it affect, so your book Before You Split was written out of some of the difficulties you and Carrie walked through. So how does that coincide? Because I was trying to piece together in the book kind of the timeline, like how old were the boys when you
Mm.
guys were struggling,
Yes.
practicing family law at that point. So kind of
Mhm.
walk us through your story, and because were you practicing family law when you guys were struggling, and did that affect your view of marriage, or had you guys
Mm.
kind of gotten to a solid footing and then you went into family law? Can you talk us through
Mhm.
the timeline a little bit of all of that?
Yes. So I would say, lowest point in our marriage was about 15 years ago.
Okay.
And so we were already well into the healing years of our marriage when I
Okay.
started practicing family law.
Okay.
The memory was fresh.
Yeah.
It was fresh enough that I could see myself on the other
Mm.
side of my desk as someone who could potentially have needed those services when Carrie and I reached the low point where we both actually considered, is this what the end looks like?
Mm.
Because
Mm.
we had struggled that much. But by the time I was practicing family law, we were into our healing years, thankfully.
Okay. I know,
I
because
believe that was a grace.
that would have complicated things, I feel like, a little bit for you. Did it trigger you at all? Like, because you said you were in your healing years. When you were
Mhm.
hearing some of those stories, did it trigger you to like almost enter back into that pain? Did you have to kind of remind yourself, no, we're okay, we're safe?
No, I wasn't triggered, honestly. At that point, it's my practice, it had this impact.
Mm.
I would feel like I just need to hold on to Carey tighter. Like
Mm.
I just need to be more merciful and, more available. Like it honestly had a motivating impact. And I've talked to other family lawyers who felt the same way, that as far as the impact of their practice went, it just made them more grateful, more, wanting to love on their spouse.
Mm, I love that. I love that. So tell us about those like that period of time when y'all's marriage, there's my southern. I'm hearing a little bit of the Canadian in, and then but you're not actually Canadian, right? You grew up in the States. Am I right on that?
Well, I am a dual citizen.
Okay.
So I do have the Canadian culture because we moved here when I was in kindergarten. So I went all the way through
Okay.
my schooling years in Canada. And
Okay.
my parents are Canadian citizens, but dad had gone to college in Michigan. And then
Okay.
we lived in northern New York State for my first 5 years. And then we moved here as I was starting kindergarten.
Okay.
So I do have dual citizenship,
Okay.
which I'm thrilled about at this point.
I love that. Well, I'm hearing
Mhm.
the outs and the boats, and then I'm over here like y'all and fixing, and so people are gonna be like, "What is happening?" Um, but talk us through those really low years. Like,
Mm,
because I believe Carrie was a pastor,
yes.
so you guys were leading a church, and then your marriage is
Mhm.
falling apart at the seams. I mean, talk us through
Mm.
that season.
Mhm. So I became a Christian just before I went to law school.
Okay.
So it was an encounter that I had with an evangelist in Switzerland, of all places, while I was traveling.
That's
This
wonderful.
conversation where I first heard about having a personal relationship with Jesus, and I decided at that point, yes, I want to follow Jesus. It didn't completely come out of the blue because I'd been in a mainstream church
Mm,
before that, but it was a very cultural church experience. If you know what I mean by that, it
yeah.
was
Yeah.
very ritualistic. We
Yeah.
followed a liturgy. So it probably planted some seeds. But anyway, then Carey and I went through law school. We were part of a group called Christian Legal Fellowship. So
Okay.
I was completely sold out on my faith. And then Carey went to seminary. We didn't plant a church. We ended up, Carey went as a pastor student
Okay.
to a charge in the Presbyterian church. And so we started our ministry fully zealous for following Christ and this calling that Carey clearly had a call experience. We both were part of it, to pastor a church. So we jumped into ministry and we really started at 100 miles an hour.
Mm,
Like we already had a 3-year-old, and we moved out of our community about an hour and a half north. And with 2020 hindsight, we can see that we were pretty isolated.
mm.
We didn't have mentors. We were starting a new thing in a community where we really, didn't have Google, didn't have Zoom. We just started out in ministry. And I think as time went on, and we were both, I was working as a pharmacist, Carey was leading the church started growing very quickly.
Mm,
We stumbled on not being able to establish like ways of communicating with
yeah.
each other. We were really tripped up by our emotions. I didn't realize until we were several years into our marriage that I had a trauma that from my childhood that had impacted, everything, like had profound impacts that I just wasn't seeing. And Carey had his own stuff. And where we started out okay in the first few years, once we had a home, had 2 children, had these professional pursuits, very full lives, we just started to run into these problems personally that seemed to go from bad to worse.
Mm,
And even despite our best intentions, like we had that frustration that we really wanted things to work, and yet we would be triggering each other,
mm.
and not intending to, but we were triggered, and then our responses to conflict separated us, and we couldn't get a handle on this conflict. So eventually we ended up in counseling, thankfully.
Yeah.
And we did get to a point where I started counseling first. And then once we reached a point where I said, Carey, if you don't go to counseling, we are not going to make it.
Yeah.
And then he did go for marriage counseling with me, and we started the long, slow journey
Mm,
toward a better place in our
mhm.
marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think like I love how you ended with the long, slow journey because I think sometimes people are like, okay, like, we're doing all the right things. Why aren't things turning around right away? And it's
Mm,
like, no, one of the things my husband Bryant always says is, in some of his messages, he'll say, it took you 25 years to get to where you are. And
mm,
then he's like, Nicole and I'll get the emergency call of like, we're in crisis. And it's like, it took you 25 years to get there. It's not going to take one night to get you out, like it takes
mm.
time.
Yes, that is so very true. And the longer you've been married, the longer you've been struggling,
Yeah.
I think the more true that is. And that's why I like to talk about the principle of the harvest.
Mm,
That if you don't like the harvest you're getting in your marriage right now, then
mhm.
plant new seeds.
Yeah.
When you plant seeds, the principle of planting seeds, and
Yeah.
it takes time for them to germinate and grow and then produce a harvest. So you keep your eyes focused on the harvest, but you need to plant the seeds now.
Yes, yes, 100%. And I think like we have several friends that are kind of at a turning point in their marriage where it's been, 15, 17 years of operating a certain way. And then a
Yes.
crisis happens. And then it's like, okay, we've got to kind of turn this ship around.
Mhm.
And, it's been like 2, 3, 4 years of working really hard and diligently of turning the ship around. And I think there's something to celebrate the small victories. Like, yeah, you may not be
Mm,
exactly where you are, but celebrate that you see the little sprout coming through the dirt, like you said, celebrate the
yes.
tiny little apple, or I know it's not exactly the size you want yet, but celebrate those things because
Mm,
again, like to turn something around after 15, 17, 20 years, that's difficult to do. Were
mhm,
you guys at what point did you guys ever have to come forward like with the elders or however your church was set up like, hey, we're struggling, we're in counseling, like we are
mhm,
headed down a bad path? Or is it
mhm.
one of those things where you guys are like, okay, we're going to get into counseling and do what we need to do, and if we can't turn it around, then we'll, send out for help? Like at what point were you guys, we've got to send out
Mhm.
for help?
Yeah, we were the latter.
Okay.
We didn't reach out to the elders for help, and not that we couldn't have, because we had a group of fantastic elders, and I think the counseling process was enough for us to
Mm,
put one foot in front of the other.
yeah.
We both did reach a point, a very difficult point where Carey burnt out,
Mm,
and I struggled with depression. And
mhm.
we've talked about this publicly, that those
Yes.
periods really lined up with each other. So I think that was a point where Carey did lean into the elders at that point. I honestly can't say whether he talked to any one of them about our marriage. I'm really not sure about that, Nicole.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they were so loving, supportive, and wise that it wouldn't have surprised me if Carey
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Um, but it wasn't, we didn't make a formal approach or write a letter or convene a meeting with them,
Yes.
because we, by the grace of God, were able to move forward and put one foot in front of the other,
Yeah.
and find healing.
But I think the most important thing, and I have a podcast coming out here soon with my friend Emily, and she and her husband pastor a church in Boston. And there was a season where she found out, and she shares this in the podcast, where she stumbled across him doing research on how to commit suicide. And she
Mhm.
was like, we've got to take this to the elders. Like, she
Mhm.
talks about how there was a little bit of trepidation of like, okay, what was going to happen, you know?
Mhm.
The elders actually flew him to a center for him to get help, filled the
Yes.
pulpit for 6 months for him. And then when he came
Yes.
back healthy, let him resume his role. And we were just talking about the importance of having, just like what you and Carrie had, healthy,
Mm.
strong elders, so that
Yes.
people in our positions who are pastoring churches and leading churches, when we get into a place where we're struggling or having, when we need help, we're not afraid of like, oh, you're going to get fired, lose your health insurance. You know, you're going to be,
Mm.
but no, you're going to be
Yes.
supported, and we're going to help you get the help you need.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we are designed to be a body, right? And to
Yes.
operate that way. And yes, healthy leadership at the top is just so key. But we're human,
Yeah.
right? We're all
Yep.
human. And to deny what's there, if there's anxiety or if there's depression, like to deny it only makes things worse.
Mm.
And I have to put up my hand and say, there were, to some extent, there were periods where I was denying too. Like the healing journey for us was probably longer and more drawn out than it potentially could have been,
Yeah.
because I had some internal resistance to taking the next step.
Mm.
And so, part of my hope in talking about these things is to break down that internal resistance for someone else, that
Yeah.
if you hear my experience, and my encouragement, and it helps someone else jumpstart their growth, that would be a real win.
Yeah.
It would make the uncomfortable emotions that go along with telling a vulnerable story
Yes. Yes.
worthwhile.
And what was that conversation like with Carey? Because, Carey's got this huge podcast. I mean, and he's known by all of these top leaders. And so then you sit down and you're like, all right, Carey, like I want to write a book. And I
Mm,
basically want to tell them about our journey, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I'm going to get
mm.
really honest. And what do you think? Like, you know, like, did that take him a second to wrap his mind around, or was he like, let's go, like,
Well, there was an evolution in that conversation.
okay.
So it started off as just a conversation in the car where I was sharing some of the overall themes of what I was learning from my
Yeah.
law practice, and things like, that you've probably seen this operate before. I say beware the cheerleaders,
Yes.
um, and that just meaning that there are going to be some people who may lead you toward divorcing,
Mm,
not because they're intending to, or they're not well intentioned or malicious or anything, not that, but just because that's where they're at in their lives, and they're looking for community like all of us are,
yeah.
and they're looking for acceptance like all of us are.
Yeah.
And that may be absolutely the right thing for them, but it may not be the right thing for you.
Yeah.
And so I started talking about some of these themes, and Carey said, "Oh, you've got to write a book." And we ended up shortly after that having a conversation with his book agent, and
Okay.
she said, "You've got to write a book." And I thought, I kind of dismissed those because Carey is very optimistic and always filled with ideas.
Yeah.
And well, a book agent, I figured that she tells everyone they need to write a book,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes. Which they don't,
So
but yes.
yeah. And so once I actually did get into the process and write the proposal, I think I went through 3 drafts. So
Okay.
Carey and I went through conversations at that point over which stories are going to make it into the book and which
Yeah.
ones didn't. So in the end, he was very much on board, like I think very vulnerable
Mm,
himself,
mm.
because we both had to agree on the telling of the stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he's just on board with allowing our pain to be a springboard for someone else if it
I
can
love
help.
that. Yeah. And it's so like, it's so powerful, especially people in your position, for those of us who maybe are listening, who you're in some kind of ministry role, and you feel like your marriage is the one thing you have to keep so secret, because
Mm,
it's struggling, and what are you going to do, and can you still minister, and can you still lead, and so to
mm.
hear stories like y'all's is just so powerful, and that was one thing for us. Our first year of marriage, I was diagnosed, we met, got engaged, and got married within a year. It was crazy. And then
Wow.
a couple months after we got married, my husband was named lead pastor of our
Yes.
small church at the time. And then my wheels just fell off. And within that first year of marriage, I was diagnosed with borderline
Wow.
personality disorder, anxiety, depression. And similar to you, there was trauma and stuff I had stuffed down and had never realized until you get into this marriage relationship, right? And you're constantly
Yes.
bumping up with someone else, and it's bringing all this stuff
Mm,
out.
yes.
And because
Mhm.
marriage is one of the most vulnerable things you're ever going to do, and trusting your heart and life to someone else.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
so I just remember we were so broken. We had no context for mental illness, and just felt so alone because we didn't feel like anyone was sharing these stories. And I'm so thankful
Yes.
over these past couple of years that people like you and Carey have been brave enough to be like, no, we're going to end the silence and start talking about these things, because people
Mhm.
need hope. I love it.
Mhm.
It's so
Mhm.
powerful.
Yeah, I think in the earlier days, in the earlier years when we were closer to the real struggle,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have been as helpful for us um,
Yes.
to share things publicly. Now, in those years where you're really struggling, you need community. Like
Mm,
you need to have a few close people who really know what's going on,
yeah.
and the wisest, most empathetic people you can find in your circle to reach out to, and a counselor. You need to have people who are in your corner. But sharing, for us to have shared the whole, mess of what we were going
You weren't
through
ready.
behind the scenes,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have been helpful for people because it would have been too raw.
Yeah, yeah. You have to give yourself that time to get on stable footing, and you have to wait for that moment. And that's why Bryant and I just have recently, over the past 2 years, really been talking about it, because you've got to wait for God to say, go, it's go time,
Mhm,
until
mhm,
he gives kind of that
mhm,
permission of, okay, you're ready. It's so important to wait.
mhm.
And you've been saying this a couple of different times, and I think it's so important. You talk about, like, the cheerleaders who are going to cheer you on, maybe towards divorce, or cheer you on. So, I've had a couple of friends that are in a difficult marriage right now, and just been talking to me about, you know, what is the balance between letting things go when you're in a place where maybe your voice has not been heard in your marriage, where maybe you feel
Mhm.
like you've kind of put yourself at the back burner, where maybe you feel like you've sacrificed to make the marriage good. What is the balance between continuing to live sacrificially, as we're called to do, and to live selflessly, but also have a voice and make sure your voice is heard? What is that balance? Can you, because I know even in the book, kind of reading, I know there were times where you would talk about you didn't feel like you were being heard, and just being
Mhm.
frustrated over that. So where's the point of, okay, I'm going to lay my life down because I love my spouse, or no, I'm going to kind of step up because my voice needs to be heard and I don't want to lose my voice?
Yeah, that is such a tricky question.
Mm,
I think everybody's, uh, you know, individual, unique circumstances really warrant a second opinion. When that question is really not clear, because it's true that in marriage you need to give some space for the fact that your spouse is also a learner, going through life.
mm,
If you have faith, you may see your life as a journey, a sanctification journey where we're
yeah,
not there yet, but gradually we're becoming holy. But right now we're imperfect.
yeah.
And on the other hand, there are some ways that we can hurt our spouses, and the hurt needs to be addressed.
Mm.
And so I do try to draw this distinction between a marriage that's unhappy and a marriage that's harmful.
I
And
love that
and that is
distinction. Yeah.
such a tricky distinction to make.
Mm,
I think people end up sometimes wondering about where they fall. Is this unhappy? Are we experiencing triggers, and our emotions are bumping up against each other? And, when we're triggered, we say
Mm.
things we don't mean to say, do things we don't mean to do, but it's unhappy. And
Yeah.
that's where Carey and I were. I mean,
Yeah.
at times I would say that we fought like cats and dogs, but it was still mutual, and neither of us were actually in harm's way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Could you say emotionally abusive? Yeah, maybe,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
perhaps. I mean, emotionally abusive, I think, it's a really broad term that
Yep.
needs some specificity.
Mm-hmm,
And a counselor can help to parse that out.
mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, there are ways that our behavior can stray into harm, where it's toxic, it's destructive. And for example, if there's an addiction that is really having, that there's behaviors going on in the house that are hurting people,
Yeah.
then you may need to reach the point where you say, I love you too much to allow you to continue behaving this way
Mm-hmm,
in our
mm-hmm.
home. And if you've been trying to guide your spouse or influence your spouse to reach out and get help, and you're just not able to get anywhere, I
Yeah.
think that's a time when you call on a close friend, you call on a mentor, you call on a pastor or
Yeah.
a counselor, and you try to get some help. Try to have that conversation as a three-way conversation, or
Yeah.
perhaps a group conversation. But just my point is, don't try to address that question on your own.
Mm.
You need the benefit of the wisdom and advice from someone else as well.
Yeah. And you talk over and over, and I love this about the power of emotions and how emotions can
Mhm.
sometimes overtake and cause you to make decisions that you don't need to make yet, and I love that you made that distinction. So I think, like, my question is when you're just feeling overwhelmed with the emotion, because you talk too about, when you're in a difficult place in your marriage, the fear, the anxiety,
Mm,
sometimes the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, all those things just get so overwhelming. And you mentioned this,
mhm,
I love this. Like, your first thought is just, I got to get out of there. It's almost like the adrenaline rush, like
mhm,
fight or flight,
mhm.
So how do
Yes.
we practically, and I think you've already landed on probably the main answer to that is community, but how do we practically lay our emotions aside so that we can see our marriage for what it is? Like, okay,
Mhm.
it's just unhappy, we can get help, or no, it's taken a harmful turn. So how do we lay those emotions aside so we can really get a clear view of where our marriage is at?
Mhm. I think the first thing I would want to say is that I don't want to give the message of ignoring emotions.
Mm,
I
mm,
think we need to look at them for what they are
I love
and
that.
see what we can learn.
Yeah.
So if you've had an incident with your spouse where you've ended up triggered, or maybe both of you have ended up triggered, once you've calmed down, then, and I would say, once you're at the point where you're triggered, just agree in advance that you are not going to go any farther.
That's so
That
wise.
there's have a code word or a hand signal or something that just gives you like time out.
Yeah.
This is it. And it's hard to do when you're triggered. So try to intervene when
Mm,
when your body is starting to give you those signals that you're heading into the red zone. So
mhm.
you know that green is calm, and that yellow, things are starting to get a bit more heated, and then
Yeah.
once you're red, you're triggered.
Yep.
Once you're heading from yellow to red, agree in advance that you're going to call the timeout, that you're going to walk away.
Mm,
Actually, just walk away. It doesn't mean that the important issue or the incident is dead to you and you're going to leave it behind and ignore it, because often there are important things like financial discussions or parenting issues. But you just agree that you're going to walk away.
mm.
And don't let the trigger just sit there and keep recurring and recurring, because chances are it's just going to keep getting worse.
Yeah.
You need to try to learn what you can from it. So go back and do a debrief and ask yourself, what happened here? Did we have different expectations?
Mm.
take a closer look at expectations? Or did the emotions seem to come out of nowhere, and it was, it was maybe a 2-level provocation from my spouse, but I triggered into a, a 9-level response?
Yeah.
What's under that? Was that so triggering?
Yeah.
In my experience, that's where I needed a counselor's advice
Mm,
and expertise to help me understand what was going on beneath the surface.
mm,
And if you're a person of faith, this is, I think, where your faith journey comes in as well,
mhm.
that it's important to pray, like lay it out before Jesus and ask him to reveal whatever it
Yeah.
is there in the darkness.
Yeah.
um, but also, praying in a group, reading. I found that exploring whatever has been revealed from authors who have experience, like, dealing with anxiety, dealing with fear, dealing with intimidation, you know
Yeah.
that, that can really help. But we really took a multifaceted approach at that point. So as far as the emotions go, I think you need to learn from them. And
Mm,
then there is a role for just developing self-control.
mm,
There are various strategies that you can use so that your emotions don't escalate the way they did.
mm,
I mentioned one of them, learning about expectations, how they might be clashing, how you might need to work through a process to adjust them.
mhm,
It may be that you are just not connecting with each other emotionally and not giving each other a safe emotional space.
mm.
And if you could actually work on giving each other permission to have your emotions, it may
Oh, I
actually
love that.
draw you closer.
Yeah.
I spend a whole chapter talking about that because I think it's such an important area and emerging area.
Mm, mm.
We need to know more about this, about attachment and how we need to be attached to each other. A lot of us, I think, have gone through shaky, sketchy attachment experiences in our childhood, and we're bringing them into our marriages and not really understanding what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what's so powerful about your book too, is that you deal with, you talk about, I love the chapter. I was telling Bryant about when you guys like were submerged in the mud. I think you were at the beach or you were somewhere and you and Carrie both got in like this, you made your own little mud bath or whatever. He was dying. Um, but you talk about how, when you get a mud bath or go flying around in mud, like
A
mud
mud
gets.
spa.
Yes, yes, your mud's ball. Mud gets stuck in places for like weeks on end. And you don't even realize, until you're taking your 50th shower and you're like, I still haven't gotten that mud out, And so you equate that to kind of like what we've drug in from our generational baggage, our past, whatever that
Mm,
is. And so you
mm,
deal with like kind of dealing with the mud of your past and realizing like sometimes we have blind spots to that mud and we don't see it until we get into relationship. And
mm,
that's what happened with Bryant and I. And then you also talk about like faulty expectations. And so you deal with all these things, but I love because it's so it's powerfully simple. What you're saying is that so often in marriage, we're triggered. We're triggered by something of our past. We're triggered by, unmet expectations,
mm,
whatever that. And so really and then we're triggered and then we trigger our spouse and now we're off to the races. We're just trigger, 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 trigger. And you're right. It compounds, it gets exponentially worse. And so getting into counseling, figuring out what those triggers are. And I love what you said, like, let's not ignore our emotions, but let's allow them to kind of send off that flare signal of like, hey, something's amiss. Let's get to the bottom of it. Like, we're not going to give into these and just say, well, this is just how I'm going to feel the rest of my life. But no, like, what is this communicating to me? I love how
mm,
you said that. It's so
mm.
good. So you talk a little bit too about how children are affected. And I love how you dealt with this. It was a couple of different chapters. And so talk to us a little bit about the importance of, because it is something that I've heard a lot is just stay together for the kids,
Mhm,
or we're not just going to stay together for the kids. And
mhm.
so both of those responses, how there's probably positives and negatives, pros and cons to both of those responses, but kind of some of your wisdom in speaking into, okay, what do we do about the children when we're in a difficult spot in our marriage?
Yes. Yeah, my heart goes out to any of you who are listening right now who are in a tough place in
Mm.
your marriage and worried about your kids, because I remember being in that place myself and staring at the ceiling and wondering, are my kids going to be okay
And
when
how old were the boys when you were in the middle of
so
this?
they would have been in around the middle school years.
Okay.
I would say it was in those years where they were, for example, 7 and 11, 8 and 12. They're
Okay.
4 years apart. So in those years, Carrie and I really did struggle with conflict.
Mm.
And so I would say from everything that we've been through and what I've seen with other couples as well, that worry can motivate you to think that the first thing you need to do is separate and get the two of you parents apart so that you stop the exposure your kids are getting to your
Mm.
conflict.
Mm.
Or it can also be not just conflict, but because your relationship isn't good right now and there's maybe a cold war going on, there's too much silent treatment, it's kind
Mm.
of icy. You don't want your kids to be exposed to that either, because you want the best for them. You want them
Yeah.
to see what a healthy relationship looks like. And so I get that, but I would say the first thing that parents need to do is just pursue peace
Mm.
between the two of you, because your kids honestly need both of you.
Mm.
And while your emotions are confusing and overwhelming, it may feel like, well, I feel like I'm done with this relationship with my spouse,
Mhm.
so my kids must be done with them too.
Mm.
Like,
Mm.
I can
Mm.
get caught in a negative mindset so that I'm no longer really seeing clearly the positives that my spouse is actually offering to our kids.
Wow.
And I think that's really common with parents who are wired differently, where it's typical to have a non-anxious parent and an anxious parent. And so the anxious parent's tendency is to dismiss the role of the non-anxious parent
Mm.
because they think, like, they're too lax, they're irresponsible.
Yeah.
Actually, your non-anxious influence on your kids is also really important.
Mm.
It
Mm.
stretches them to take some risks. And anyway, so
I
the
love that.
most urgent thing is that the time for peace is now. And the first thing you really need to do is just figure out what it is you need to do so that your child's experience of your home is more peaceful,
Mm.
is more characterized by witnessing kindness and respect between
Mm.
the two of you, that they're not caught in loyalty conflicts,
Mm.
that there is no competition between the parents for the kids' affections.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
know that happens. And they're also not being exposed to just the venting
Mm.
that parents do. And sometimes parents lean emotionally on their kids in regard to their marriage in a way that messes up your child's sense of emotional safety and security.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because in reality, unless it's an extreme case, your child needs both of you,
Yeah.
and they need the security and the emotional safety to actually maintain and not feel that either of those bonds, that their bond with both of their parents is secure.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so figuring out how to make the environment safe for your kids is, in my opinion, the number one priority.
Mm.
Because the research shows that over time, even if a divorce happens in the future, the kids who make it through and are well as adults, like physically, emotionally, they are the kids whose parents were cooperative with each
Mm.
other. And so that level of cooperation is critically important to your kids. And so if you divorce right away as your first step, the problem is that you haven't resolved the relationship problems, and you've added the complication of the other problems that need to be resolved.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it is hard. Like I said, my heart goes out to anyone who's in those circumstances. But focusing in on what your kids need,
Mm,
as a first step, and just parking the idea. I
mm,
don't know what's going to happen as far as divorce. You probably don't know what's going to happen as far as divorce goes. But one thing that you really do need for the sake of your kids is to figure out how you're going to be cooperative
yeah.
with each other as parents, and bring yourself around to the point where you can wholeheartedly agree that your child needs both of you.
Yeah. And I think that's like the practical side of your book that I so appreciated, because I think sometimes we can get into these situations where we're so fearful. We're like, got to just get out. That's our body's natural
Mm.
reaction to danger. We
Yes.
feel like we're in
Yes.
danger. And we
Mhm.
forget that getting out isn't going to take care of the conflict that you have with that
Mhm.
person. You're still going to have to face them. You're going to have to co parent. You're going to have to do all of those things. So,
Mhm.
unless you figured out how to live in peace, it's still going to be very complicated.
Mhm.
Um, and I love that you didn't necessarily say this is what you should do or shouldn't do. Like, you should split or you shouldn't split. You are just putting out, hey, here's some practical things to think through in the
Mhm.
process, things that I have learned from my experience. And it was just, I just think it'll be so helpful to anyone who's trying to figure out what their next step is.
Mhm.
So you have a podcast and a website and all sorts of fun stuff going on. So what are some of the things that you cover in your podcast that you can tell us about if someone's like, man, I want to get to know Toni more? What sorts of things do you guys cover in your podcast?
Well, we cover family life,
Okay.
so we do address marriage and parenting. We
Love it.
try to tackle those things that families are facing, that that cause problems in people's everyday lives.
Mm,
So we try to talk to practitioners or researchers or experts in their field, who have things to say about ADHD, for example,
love
and
that.
autism, and how to collaboratively problem solve with your kids.
Yes.
We talk about marriage and how to have a good sex life when your kids are young. We talk about forgiveness, how to make an apology sincere. So we just try to tackle those issues that can trip
That is
people up and
amazing.
make life more difficult, because we want people to love being home.
Yes, yes. Okay, so everyone listening to my podcast, you hop off of here and you go find Toni's podcast and you listen. That is amazing. And I do love, you said sex. You addressed sex in your book a little bit, which I loved. One of the things that we're just going to take a hard right turn for like 2 seconds because we're running out of time here. But one of the things that I learned, I had a bunch of trust issues, and I did not realize how deep seated my trust
Mm,
issues ran.
right.
Um, and so when Bryant and I were kind of at the worst of it, I was seeing a licensed mental health counselor here in Valrico. But then I was suicidal, sitting on the ground with knives, just
Mm,
getting to the point where Bryant was like, okay, we need something like now. We need an intervention now. So we went and
yeah.
met with a couple in Georgia who specifically meets with ministry couples.
Yes.
And we were there for like 2 or 3 days. And one of the things that she told me, because I was like, I don't trust Bryant. I don't trust him. I'm scared. And she was
Mm,
like, are you still being intimate? Like, are you still having sex? And I said, yes,
mm,
that's not been a problem for me. And she was like, then that's a good sign, because deep in your heart, then you do trust him, to be able to give
mm,
yourself to him in that way. And there was something I needed to hear that, because I was like, okay, we've got a level of foundation of trust to work off of. It's not all
yeah.
gone, you know? And
Yeah.
you dealt with that a little bit about how you and Carey were still having sex in the midst of it. That had not
Yes.
stopped.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes we just throw out the sex thing like, oh, that's just that's it. And you talk about the importance of having an intimate sexual relationship with your partner, that's an important foundation to your marriage.
Yes. Yeah, I am grateful that for us, we did continue our sex life. And
Yeah.
although in the bad years, I would say that we probably didn't have sex as frequently
Yeah.
as we should have. Like there was, so there were some days where we both just couldn't go there.
Right.
Um, but we really wanted, like we were really actually fighting for our relationship,
Mm,
even though we were fighting for each other. And
yeah.
part of that was that we were married, and so we were going to keep having sex. And it's not like we were having having crappy sex.
Yeah.
And so
We're
it's
going there. Okay.
yeah. So it's just one way that you can still stay connected, even if your
Yeah.
emotions like aren't lining up. And I know everyone's experience is unique. And in
Mhm.
some cases, you're going to struggle with that. But I would say just, don't let your sexual relationship go. Um, and leave it by the wayside.
Mm,
That
mhm.
it's worth fighting for,
Yeah.
because maybe there is an issue there. Maybe you do need to talk to a counselor. Maybe there's a medical issue. But the research shows, it's interesting that they did research on this question of whether long-term sex, like long-term relationship sex, sort of fizzles out,
Yeah.
or does it still offer you something in terms of bonding? And what they found is that for long-term relationships, and they were defining long-term as 10 years and more,
Okay.
um, that orgasm, those hormones that are released actually do have a powerful bonding effect.
Mm, mm,
And the bonding impact is comparable to what happens between a mom and her infant,
mm.
when they are attuned. And
Yeah.
so it's not true that long-term relationship sex, has to get boring, or that it's something that we can just toss aside and not care about.
Yeah.
It's really, really important. And it's just part of your intimacy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm grateful that in those years we did stay connected. And I just want to give people hope
Yeah.
that even if you've been triggered and your emotions are tearing you apart, go after that, and don't leave it by the wayside, but
Mm.
really take some steps to see if you can morph those whatever's happening into a better place.
Yeah. Yeah. And there is something so intimate when you start getting honest with each other with your sexual relationship, and pursue to make that better, like Bryant and I have been
Mhm.
married. We're at the 10-year mark. And
Oh,
um
congratulations.
thank you. Thank you. I realized, like, oh my gosh, we're like 2 months away from May, but 11 years in May. But sex had been something that I had not, it had been so messed up for me, and I had not realized. And so our first few years, sex was just me going through the motions for him, and then I had to do all this
Mhm.
research and read a lot of like faith-based books on sex that actually really helped me.
Mhm.
And I give kudos to them, because usually faith-based books on sex are not very good. And just had to learn, like, no, God has given us sex. God has given us the desires for pleasure. And as we enter into that with our spouse and start having honest conversations, and as we get creative and enjoy that within, the confines of marriage and what God's called and asked us to do, like, it can be something that's really exhilarating and really
Mhm.
does take your intimacy to a whole new level. And so there's something
Mhm.
powerful with that. And I appreciated that you had read it. I read that section to Bryant, and he's like, go Tony, go Tony. We were like, because I don't feel like enough people in the church, capital C, are talking about sex. And so we're all so screwed up about what do you do with it. And anyways, that's a topic for another podcast. But all right, leave us with some hope, Tony. Anything else
Ah.
you want to say? Leave us with some hope.
Mm. Well, in the dark days of our marriage, when I was feeling all those emotions and confused about what happens next, I didn't know whether I could ever be in love with Carey
Mm,
again.
mm,
It felt like it was so distant, that we were so mired in our conflict that honestly, I had lost the hope of a real, authentic, heartfelt connection.
mm,
And all I can say is that after we found some practical solutions, learned more about each other, walked through this journey of healing, I now have a marriage that honestly exceeds anything I would have dreamed for when we said yes to each other and started out.
yeah.
It's just far richer than we ever would have expected. And yeah, I wouldn't leave our marriage for anything. And I am so very grateful that we had the opportunity, and the friends around us, and the counselors, all the people who helped us along the way, and the grace of God,
Mm,
because I I just wouldn't have known what I would have missed
Mm, mm.
if we left when we were wondering about leaving.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I am so grateful again. You guys, the book is called Before You Split by Toni Nieuwhof. And she is this honest and has the opportunity to be even more open and honest in the book because she'd had longer than like 45 minutes to share with you. But you guys have to get this book. It is awesome. And I would say this, if you are part of the listeners who believe in Jesus Christ, you're a Jesus follower, this is a great book for you. If you're someone who's not a Jesus follower, this is a great book for you. She does not beat you over the head with faith. Um, Faith is a part of who she is. And so it's all throughout the book, but it's nothing overwhelming. And I'm going to tell you, it's so practical and you guys are just going to love it. And whether you're in a good place, Bryant and I are in a really good place in our marriage, but I still enjoyed this book because it was good for me knowing what to say and how to interact with my friends who maybe aren't in a good place. And if you aren't in a good place, you need to stop everything right now and order it on Amazon. And then you need to go to ToniNieuwhof.com, follow her podcasts. Toni, I cannot thank you enough for taking time with us today. This has been so powerful. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure, Nicole. Thank you for what you're doing. I love the way you're having these honest conversations with so many people. And so, yes, way to go. Keep
Thank
it
you.
up.
Thank you. And you guys don't forget to check out NicoleGolden.org for more content. And we will see you next time. Thanks for joining us. Thank you so much for tuning in to Scar Stories podcast. We all need places where we can feel seen, be safe, find connection and resources. I would love to connect with you on social media at Nicole Faye Golden. I also have a website with a ton of resources and a free 7-day Praying Scared prayer journal at NicoleGolden.org. Thank you for tuning in. I'd love it if you shared this with your friends and if you left a rating and a comment. And I look forward to seeing you next time as we delve into mental health, parenting, family, and so many other issues with a lot of my friends. We'll see you soon.